All right. Hello, lovely Intro to Performance Studies students. I am coming to you here from my living room on day 34 of quarantine. This is the fourth time I've tried to shoot this video because I've been having really weird audio problems on this computer. It's my only computer with a webcam. I apologize for the shitty audio quality. That's the best I can do today. Anyway, I hope you guys are all staying safe and healthy. And I just wanted to take a minute to say that, I hope this class is maybe a helpful distraction from the general state of the world, but I really hope that you guys are prioritizing your health and well-being right now. I personally would so much rather a class of healthy fellow students where maybe you learn a few things than a class where you submit everything on time or everything is perfect and you're not okay. I want you all to know it's been a really strange time to film these lectures. It's been difficult at times to pull myself together to do so. I really wish we were all meeting in person right now. I'm sad that we can't, but here we are. I've really enjoyed getting to read your responses on Canvas and getting to know you all slowly on Discord. If you haven't yet introduced yourself on the intro thread from last week on Canvas or haven't yet popped into the Discord, please do. That's going to help you learn more about your fellow classmates and just help us keep a sense of a classroom community even when we're all working from far away. So, sort of in this mood, I wanted to start today's class with a check-in. How are you doing? How do you feel about asynchronous teaching? What are the things that you'd like to see on our class Discord? Are there things that you'd like or things that you need from this class that you're not getting right now? I'd like you to take a few minutes, like no more than 3, to answer these questions in Thursday's check-in discussion thread. You should be able to see everyone's posts there, so know that when you're posting. And you can definitely respond to other people, but be sure to post something of your own. Take a minute to do that now. Okay. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Erving Goffman's Performance of Self in Everyday Life. Originally published in 1956, this book is based on Goffman's doctoral work, which was actually completed here at the University of Chicago in 1953. The monograph focuses on a similarity Goffman finds between theater and human behavior, namely that people tend to, quote, perform versions of themselves for others, conforming to socially mandated or regulated roles that, in turn, color their self-presentation and perception. Goffman's work remains a foundational text in performance studies, in part because of how Judith Butler takes it up in her writing on performativity and gender in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So today, we're going to start with Goffman and then work forward in time to talk about Butler's theory of performativity. At the end, we're going to take a look at a music video and apply what we've learned about performance and performativity to that. I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, I would like you all to be able to 1. Define some essential concepts from Goffman, such as the front, the mask, and the role. 2. Compare and contrast Goffman's self-presentation with Butler's theory of performativity. And 3. Analyze a performance using concepts from this lecture. Okay. Goffman's focus in the short selection we read from this monograph today is on the interplay of an individual's self-conception, their self-presentation, and their own belief in the act they are putting on. For Goffman, self-presentation is relational. It's the, quote, individual's own belief in the impression of reality that he attempts to engender in those among whom he finds himself. That's on page 10. So instead of taking a straightforward or strictly theatrical approach to everyday performances of self, Goffman uses theatrical metaphors to explain that our self-presentation is actually a second-order belief. It's a belief in what the people around us believe about us. In this, Goffman keys us into 2 ends of a spectrum of self-presentation. On the one end, we have the sincere person who is totally taken in by their own performance. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the cynical performer, whose experience of selfhood is marked by the gap between what they believe about themselves and what others believe about them. So, Goffman offers us a handful of examples of mundane, cynical performances. Quote, doctors who are led into giving placebos, filling station attendants who resignedly check and recheck the tire pressure for an anxious women motorist, shoe clerks who sell a shoe that fits but tell the customer it is the size she wants to hear. These are the cynical performers whose audiences will not allow them to be sincere, on page 11. Goffman continues on to discuss the sinister case of the confidence man, a cynical performer whose real crime is, quote, not that he takes money from his victims, but that he robs us all of the belief that middle-class manners and appearance can be sustained only by middle-class people, also on page 10. So you'll note here that the mobility of these performances, or the capacity for someone to be a cynical performer, is a source of a lot of anxiety and disease for Goffman. We're going to continue to follow the latent anxiety inherent in performance and self-presentation when we talk about Butler and gender performance, but you'll see how those terms kind of shift in Butler's lexicon. Okay, so before we move on, I would like you all to take a minute now and share an example of a cynical performance you've encountered in everyday life. And this can be a performance that you do or someone else's performance. Again, these responses should be off the cuff, relatively informal, and don't have to be in complete sentences. You should be able to read the responses of your classmates once you've added your own on this discussion thread. Thanks for sharing your responses. Okay, so back to Goffman. Goffman ends up quoting this guy, Robert Ezra Park, who's actually a former UChicago professor and one of the founders of the discipline of sociology in the United States, to start defining what he calls the mask. So Park defines the mask as, quote, the conception we formed of ourselves, the role we are striving to live up to. This mask is our truer self, the self we would like to be. That's on page 12. Now, this reminds me so much of Sigmund Freud's concept of the ego ideal, the part of the subconscious that imposes an ideal behavior on the individual that is derived from parents or society, something outside of us. For Park, and then subsequently for Goffman, even our most inner selves are part of this performance of character, and it's this performance that ends up constructing us as persons rather than individuals. And here I think the distinction persons is actually just saying like socially relational beings, rather than individual, which is like more isolated. So there's this sort of idea where even the innermost part of ourselves is something that is part of a performance. It's this like almost external thing that we put on top of ourselves. And we'll kind of keep following this idea of like internal and external as we keep talking about Butler. All right, so a few more things about Goffman. Goffman defines a front as, quote, the expressive equipment of a standard kind intentionally or unwittingly employed by the individual during his performance. That's on page 13. So, drawing on his extended theatrical metaphors, Goffman defines a front as constituted of three things: a performer's setting, their appearance, and their manner. The setting is any of the scenery or props needed for the action. Their appearance relates to the personal effects that are like physically stuck to the performer, which includes their clothing, speech patterns, race, age, size, posture, etc. And finally, their manner is related to the role that they play in the particular scenario. In general, Goffman writes that the successful front is coherent and tends towards stereotypical action. And in fact, Goffman suggests that the front's generality or stereotypicalness is part of what gives it its social utility. He writes, quote, observers need only to be familiar with a small, and hence manageable, vocabulary of fronts, and know how to respond to them in order to orient themselves in a wide variety of situations, on page 16. So this limited and therefore manageable vocabulary leads the performer to some unhappy performances. Goffman writes that, quote, the individual, as someone who possesses a limited range of sign equipment, must also make unhappy choices. And here he goes on about anesthesiologists and crofter hospitality in Scotland, but I think what he's talking about is this feeling of not having the right tools to present a coherent front or to be like a desired version of yourself, or maybe even the bristling feelings that you might have related to roles that you've been socially conscripted to play. In 1988, Judith Butler publishes Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory in Theater Journal. This precedes the publication of Gender Trouble in 1990, and I think it's a great and accessible condensation of the arguments that she ends up making in that book. You can find a copy of this article, as well as Gender Trouble and Excitable Speech, on the Canvas page next to the Goffman readings. And those are there in case you're really looking for more reading to do right now, but it's okay. I assume that you're not. Anyway, I chose this reading because it's targeted towards us as performance studies scholars, and I also think it continues Goffman's sociological interest in self-presentation in ways that feel maybe a little more relevant than housewives dithering over which silverware to use when having company. So you all might recall Butler from the Taylor reading on Tuesday, where Taylor helpfully defined performativity as both, quote, the entire regulatory system that produces gendered subjects through a series of normative behaviors and the possibilities of response. That's on page 123. In Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, Butler writes that, quote, gender is in no way a stable identity or locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. So what she's saying here is that gender doesn't have this sort of stable core or center that like prescribes how people should act, sort of like a priori or beforehand. But instead, she's arguing that gender is something that is constituted historically in time, and sort of maintains its illusion of stability through the repetition of certain bodily acts or performances. So for Butler, gender, or this illusion of this stable, natural, or essential gendered self, is merely the context for her proof for a more general theory of something that is like performance or presentation, but is really called performativity, a practice or behavior that's formed in relationship to society and endures through time because it's transmitted via bodily repetition and iteration. I want to emphasize the role of mundane, everyday bodily actions in the maintenance of these illusions of stable or natural gender. In a way, as if taking a page out of Goffman, Butler argues that the apparent substantiveness of gender is itself a construct, and one that the, quote, mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and to perform in the mode of belief. And so here I think what she's doing is really taking these sort of, like, Goffman assumes that people's performances are related to society through this like concept of the mask, but I think that her emphasis here is that there's kind of no there. I think that Goffman is still assuming that things like race or gender or class maybe are the kind of like stable and fixed things that actually exist. And I think what Butler is saying is that like maybe these things don't actually exist a priori or outside of a social compulsion to believe that they exist. So in this article, Butler is really grounding herself in second wave and particularly white feminist intellectual traditions. So if you read the article, you'll find that her starting point is actually Simone de Beauvoir's claim that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. In general, second wave feminism was invested in making a distinction between gender and sex, or arguing that there was no essential feminine essence, which in the end is an argument about how the material dimensions of the body, or like this stuff, is separate from the process through which the body comes to bear cultural meaning, or things that we might call like race, gender, sexual orientation, class. In fact, a lot of the things that Goffman describes as constituting the front. So, where Goffman is focusing on how self-presentation is like a performance, or how we have these sort of layers of performance inside of us, like the mask that represents our true self and the front that constitute how we present ourselves to others and the means by which they understand us, Butler, I think, in what is essentially a Foucauldian move, that's not super important right now though, is pointing out that there's just no inside. She writes, Goffman, quote, posits a self which assumes and exchanges various roles within the complex social expectations of the game of modern life. I am suggesting that this self is not only irretrievably outside, constituted in social discourse, but that the ascription of an interiority is itself a publicly regulated and sanctioned form of essence fabrication. I'm going to say that one again. Interiority is a publicly regulated and sanctioned form of essence fabrication. Wow. Okay, so that basically means that anything that we regard to be like essential or inside or true is actually something that comes to us from the outside, irretrievably. Like it's just out there. It's this publicly regulated fiction. Wild. Okay, excuse me. I have allergies and it's allergy day. Okay. All right. Butler goes on in this article to make a series of escalating claims built upon this observation, including that, quote, compulsory heterosexuality is reproduced and concealed through the cultivation of bodies into discrete sexes with natural appearances and natural heterosexual dispositions, on page 524, and concludes that the truth or falsity of gender is in the end only socially compelled, i.e., that there is no natural, essential, or true gender. So it's important to note that in Butler's thinking, the body is never passively gendered, but gender is also not a radical choice or a strictly individual project. Quote, just as a script may be enacted in various ways, and just as a play requires both text and interpretation, so the gendered body acts its part in a culturally restricted, corporeal space and enacts interpretations within the confines of already existing directives. That's on page 526. And, it's a little bit tempting to kind of leave things in this land of theatrical metaphor. Gender is like a performance. But I think Butler rightly points out that her metaphor is a bit off. The stakes of one's gender reality are different and often much more punitive than something like gender performance on stage. She uses a little bit of dated language in her discussion here, but she makes the example of the transvestite who on stage is often not threatening. It's often a comic relief role, but the same concept, a transvestite on a bus is something that often elicits from others like fear, responses of fear, rage, and even violence. She talks about this on page 527. In the end here, I think what she's pointing out is that theater has this derealizing power. We can write off theater as just an act and therefore make whatever kind of transgressive gender performance that's happening on stage seem less threatening. But her point is that gender reality is not a performance, but a performative. Its stakes are different. Not only is it real only to the extent that it's performed, it's real to the extent that it often can evoke punitive actions like real physical violence. We find subversive gender, like people who perform or people who have gender that subverts the norm, to be threatening in real life sometimes. So I think part of one of the important points Butler is trying to make here is that the performative nature of binary essential sex and gender is sort of concealed because true gender identity and a belief in true gender are regulatory fictions. So, in other words, her point is that there's no pre-existing, or quote, no pre-existing identity by which an act or attribute might be measured. There's no way to tell what is real gender or fake gender. And I think that that's what makes gender sort of have this revolutionary promise for her. Okay, so remember where I mentioned the latent anxiety in Goffman around performances that aren't quite coherent or don't fit together well? Well, Butler writes that gender is fundamentally, quote, what is put on, invariably, under constraint, daily and incessantly, with anxiety and pleasure. That's on page 531, and I really like that definition. There's this call to action embedded in it that gives us the responsibility to redescribe our gender reality. And paraphrasing Butler here, I take this redescription to consist of a social responsibility to both expose the roles, scripts, and expectations that serve as the cores of stable gender identities as such, while also being mindful of the various acts and strategies of disavowal, disobedience, and subversion that simultaneously constitute and conceal gender as we live it. Okay, I know that that was all kind of dense, and I really hope that if you have questions, you'll post them in Discord, and I'll do my absolute best to answer them. But please, if you have questions, do post them. Okay, we are in the home stretch here. The last thing we're going to do today. All right, I would like you to take a minute now for a short dance break, watch break, while you watch Dorian Electra's music video, Man to Man. You'll find it linked on Canvas. Once you've done that, we're going to meet back up here and talk about it. There are so many things that I want to say about this video, but really I'm curious for you all to try your hand at using some of the terms we've discussed today in a short analysis. So go take a look and then meet me back here. Awesome. Okay. I take this music video by non-binary pop artist Dorian Electra to be a primer on nonviolent communication techniques, a strong critique and subversion of masculinity via the trope of settling things man to man, and a beautiful theatrical proposition for what it might look like to live our gender realities in a very capacious way. So I'd like you all to take a minute to do a short writing exercise. How do you think this video exposes gender performativity? How does Dorian Electra accomplish this through various performances of gender stereotypes? I encourage you to reflect on the difference between Goffman's self-presentation and Butler's performativity that I've outlined in this lecture. And it may be helpful to pinpoint a particular trope of masculinity present in the video, or maybe a dance move, a set of lyrics, maybe even the vocal performance, to try and tease out the difference between these two terms. I think 10 minutes should be enough for this exercise. You don't need to sweat about it. It's sort of an informal, complete, incomplete kind of thing. And I really am looking forward to your thoughts. So 10 minutes on a timer, go for it. Okay, one last bit of business. Barring illness or emergency, I will be on our Discord server during our regular class time, Thursday, 12:30 to 1:50 Central Time, and I'll answer any questions you've posted there. I'm also working through all of the Canvas posts, and we'll have those back to you shortly. If you'd like to meet for office hours tomorrow, also known as Friday, please direct message me on Discord, or if you must, shoot me an email. I prefer to meet between 12 noon and 2 Central on Friday, but I can be pretty flexible. And you'll note that there's an assignment that's due Sunday night. I want you all to know that the rubric that I posted is just for those of you who find it helpful to have rubrics. If you're not a rubrics kind of person, don't worry about it. In a different timeline, this assignment would definitely have been a short class presentation on a piece that you basically thought was interesting from the Diana Taylor book, but it is not the timeline we are currently in. In any case, I really encourage you to do a piece that you maybe haven't heard of or an artist you're less familiar with, and know that there are a lot of resources online through the Hemispheric Institute website, which I have linked on that assignment page. Okay. Please stay healthy, everyone, and do your best to stay sane. I will see you all in cyberspace. Bye.